Once again, we gather to listen to something about Lent that will help us along the journey of Lent. And today, I'm going to kind of combine the second week and the path through the rest of Lent. In other words, last time we talked about the first Sunday of Lent, and it was all about temptation. In a sense, just a reminder that we can be tempted in many ways, as Jesus was, and we don't need to give in to temptation. But should we stumble, and that's what I'd like to think about temptation, we get up as he did on the Passion of the Cross. So, today, let me start with a prayer of St. Joseph, since this is the year of Joseph. Today, we're going to talk about the second Sunday of Lent and a few other things. So let us pray. Joseph, you are a man who carried into dark of anxious sleep the haunting mystery of deep, unsettled doubt. But yet, within and all untouched, your citadel of trust was calm, serene, and still, and flamed your unstarried night to the answering of dawn in gospel unchanging will. O carpenter of faith, build our inwardness into a city lamped with trust, and when we too must face the nights and tread the deserts and the desert ways, let us, like you, take mother and child into Egypt of each day. Good Saint Joseph, come to our aid in these times of anguish and difficulty. Take under your protection the critical and troubling circumstances of the city and of this day. Keep us calm and serene, so we are aware of your presence. Amen. As I read that prayer, I'm thinking of Vincent van Gogh's famous painting, The Starry Night, which he created out of feelings of darkness himself. It's a powerful painting that I have a copy of, and I'm always amazed at many times when you look at it, you see the dynamic aspects of that painting bringing light into the darkness. And that fits very well with our Lenten theme. So today, let's chat for a bit about temptation and transfiguration. We know that no matter what we do in life, we're going to be tempted, as Jesus was tempted, yet he never gave in. And this is a reminder to us. What was his source of remaining honest with his Father in heaven? And that was to quote against the evil spirit the Scriptures. Remember, he said, man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes forth from the mouth of God. And I think that's very important. So a recommendation that I have for Lent, along with everything else, is to take time for the Scriptures. One of the things we noticed in the Gospel is that Jesus knew the Scriptures. He knew them very well. He could quote them very easily. How about us? How well do we know the Scriptures? Probably not as good as we should. So here's a recommendation for Lent. Take 5 to 10 minutes and read a part of the Bible. Will help us gain the insight into our salvation history. For Lent, I recommend simply read the Gospels and read particularly the Passion account of Jesus in the Gospel. That reminds us that as he struggled to bring life through darkness, we too can rely on him to bring us out of darkness into light because of our time with him. Again, a reminder that we will all be tempted in life, and with Jesus at our side, we can do many different things. Now, I'd like to start and talk a bit more, perhaps about temptation, but mostly about the second Sunday of Lent, which is what you'll be coming up against in the next couple of days. First of all, you might ask the question, why does the Church have the Gospel of Temptation as the first Sunday of Lent and the Gospel on Transfiguration as the second Sunday of Lent? They seem to be in opposition to each other, yet they are very complementary. We know that we will be tempted. What we forget many times is that with the light of Christ, and that's what Transfiguration is all about, we can at least overcome the temptations or learn to live with our imperfections. And when we work at overcoming our temptations or recognizing our limitations, we allow God to touch us in many different ways, ways that we least expect. Let me tell you a little story, and this might help us understand. Sasha was a little girl, about 3 years old, and she had been the favorite of her parents because she was at that time the only child. Then her parents announced to her one day that she was going to have a sibling. She did not know exactly, nor did they, whether it was going to be a boy or a girl. But as time went by, Sasha prepared herself for the arrival of a brother or sister. When her mother gave birth to a boy, the whole family was very happy. And when they brought the baby home, one of the first things Sasha said to her parents is, "Can I go into the room with the baby and be alone with him?" And they were wondering whether or not this was a good idea. Remember, there is such a thing as sibling jealousies. And they decided that they would wait a while and told her that they'd have to wait a little bit for the child to get settled, and then maybe they would let her in. And they were afraid, quite honestly, that she might take the child and hide it somewhere, because she had always been the center of attraction. Now, I know that can happen because my brother had 3 girls, and the first 2 were close to each other in age. The third one was about a 4-year difference from the youngest girl. And one day, they couldn't find littlest one. And then they discovered that the girls, the 2 oldest girls, had put her in the closet because they didn't want anything to do with her. After all, they'd been the center of attention. So Sasha's parents were right in wondering what Sasha would do. But one day, they finally gave in and said she could go into the nursery and be with the baby alone, her brother. And fortunately, the house was old, or the door was not closed tight, so they could peek in and see what was happening. Sasha walked over to the baby and put her face next to his, cheek to cheek. And when the parents asked why she was doing that, her comment was, "I wanted to see what God feels like." Powerful imagery for a 3 or 4-year-old child to see in this innocent baby that this was indeed a godlike creature. Lent is like that for you and I. We need to try to remember what God feels like in our lives. Now, the second Sunday of Lent is a story that can connect to that. It's the Transfiguration of Jesus with Peter, James, and John. And there's a lot of good things in this story that could take you a whole week to meditate on. What was taking place? Jesus took his favorite apostles, you might say, Peter, James, and John, up to a high mountain, Mount Tabor. And it is kind of high for Israel. And in order to get there, you take a taxi and you drive up to the top of the mountain. And when I was in Israel visiting, the taxi driver was very exciting because he liked to spin around those curves, the switchbacks. And I asked him, I said, did you ever lose anybody? Oh, yeah, we had a few people go off the edge, which made the trip a little bit more serious to me. I thought maybe I'd be transfigured by the time I get to the top of the hill. But we got there. And the story of Peter, James, and John is very enlightening. What did they see? Scripture is very good at telling us they saw the image of Christ glowing. The image of Christ was bathed in a bright light. And next to Jesus was Elijah the prophet and Moses. Elijah representing the prophets and Moses the law. What did that say to them when they realized what was going on? That Christ came to fulfill the law and the prophets. And this is very, very good. Now, there is a nice human side to this. Peter said at one point, Lord, it is good for us to be here. Let us build 3 tents or booths, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. The gospel tells us that he did not know what he was saying. So Jesus said no, in so many words. When the apostles looked back up, the vision was gone. Christ appeared to them normally, and Moses and Elijah were gone. They were very excited. When they came down the mountainside, Jesus said to them, do not tell anyone about this until the Son of Man has risen from the dead. Now, this is one of the first times that he speaks to them of life after death and what it means. They did not quite understand what was going on. Why? And there was good reason for this. Jesus said, do not tell anyone about this until the Son of Man rises from the dead. But what had to come first? The passion and death on the cross. And they were not quite ready to understand all of this. It took a little bit of time. And only when they witnessed the passion and death of Jesus and then come to the Feast of Pentecost did they understand all of what Jesus said and did for them. But one of the characteristics of the Transfiguration is the light of Christ coming to them. In a sense, they saw the glory of God shining in and through Jesus, and they were awestruck by that. Now, here's the question. Do we see the glory and light of Christ and light of God in other people, as well as perhaps ourselves? It's very important that we realize that we see God in many different ways. Like that little child. We see God in a newborn babe. We see God, the light of God, in events that surround our lives, particularly joyful events and celebrations. Maybe during Lent, besides reading and journeying with Jesus through the passion and death on the cross, we take some time to ponder how has Christ manifested himself to us in our current lives. Now, there's many things going on in our society these days, politically, socially, spiritually, and we get caught up with all those events, and we sometimes fail, or neglect, I should say, to recognize Jesus in our midst. And maybe I'll tell you a story about how I met Jesus and didn't know it. And that happens to a lot of us. But what's important here with the Transfiguration is faith and then hope. Faith in the fact that Jesus came to fulfill the law and the prophets. We have to not only know and understand that as much as we can, we have to live with it and own it in our personal lives. How well have you and I touched the face of Jesus in our midst? We think of great saints and this little girl. Oh, that was a unique experience. But Jesus comes into our life often, And yet we are so preoccupied with self that we cannot realize Jesus in the other person. It's very important to understand that as best as we can. Now, it may not be as dramatic as this little girl and her brother, but it is significant that we recognize Jesus in our midst. One of my favorite people, and I'll tell you the story now, is Dorothy Day. She was a very interesting person, quite controversial, yet her main purpose was the love of the poor and to take care of them as much as possible. When I was a young priest, 5 years ago, when I was a young priest, a priest friend of mine decided to go to New York City and asked me if I would go with him, which I did because my parents lived in Washington Heights in New York City. And he said to me, when we get there, I'll take you out to a fancy restaurant for dinner. And anybody who knows me knows that's a good calling card, because I would readily say yes. Well, we got to the city, got to my parents' house, and then later that afternoon and evening, we went to go downtown to eat. Now, we didn't take my car, because at that time, probably still is, it's a nightmare to try to drive downtown Manhattan in your car. So we got dressed up. We were on vacation, so I wasn't wearing a collar or anything, but just a nice suit that I had, and a shirt and tie, and all that stuff. We got on the train, and the person I was with, who was another priest, said, I'm not going to tell you where we're going. I'm just going to take you there. I said, okay. Now, having grown up in the city and having worked in Midtown Manhattan, I thought I knew practically almost where every good restaurant was, even though I may not have eaten there. But be that as it may, as the train came to Midtown Manhattan, he said, no, we don't get off here. I said, oh. The train went on. He went to Lower Manhattan. You might all remember it as Lower Manhattan is where the World Trade Center was. We finally got off at Canal Street, I think, and I thought to myself, there's not many good restaurants down in this area of Manhattan. But after a block or two, we turned a corner, and there was a sign over a door that said Soup Kitchen. I thought to myself, this is not Class A restaurant that I was thinking about. Anyway, we went in, and sure enough, what it was a soup kitchen run by college students for the poor people of that area. Well, we were there. Me in my fancy suit, him in one too, and we sat down amongst the people, and then we were invited to get online for our meal. What was the meal? Take a soup bowl, cereal bowl, and they plopped rice into it and something that looked like a meatball, and the grease just surfaced to the top. Considering that I was expecting a Class A restaurant, it was not to my delight. Anyway, we sat down at a table that was made of long boards resting on sawhorses. The man opposite me hardly looked at me. I scarcely looked at him, but he was sitting there with a long brown coat on, as many people of the street did. And I had my meal for what it was worth. Upstairs, we were taken upstairs by a college student. By the way, for dessert, the men were given cigarettes and the women were given chocolate bars. I've never figured that one out. But anyway, they took us around and we went upstairs. And in the corner of this room upstairs, an elderly lady was folding up papers called the Daily Worker. That elderly worker turned out to be Dorothy Day. We didn't talk very long, but it was enough to be able to say that I met her. Anyway, we went out back to the train, and I'm getting on the subway. It took about 40 minutes to get back up to Washington Heights, where we lived, and I'm steaming a little bit, disappointed that I did not get the meal that I wanted to get or hoped for. All I did was sit in front of a man who didn't want to look at me, and really I didn't want to look at him, and he had dark brown eyes, and he just ate very quietly, and we didn't talk. About halfway up to Upper Manhattan, it dawned on me, as I was lamenting what I had missed as far as a good meal, that that man sitting opposite me, in a sense, was Jesus Christ. In other words, I had had dinner with Jesus, and I didn't even recognize him in our midst. That's the way Jesus appears to us. And I've never forgotten, and even to this day, if I close my eyes, I can picture that man and picture the scene around us. When I finally realized what had happened and how I reacted, I was disappointed at my reaction. Jesus was in our midst, in that man, and I did not recognize him. This is what Lent is really all about. It's a reconversion of our attitudes towards the presence of Christ in our lives. And that is what we want to be concerned about. How do you recognize Jesus today? Today is very tough because politically and socially and even spiritually, there's so much going on that we prejudge situations, which is not very good. Today we are asked to be very conscious of who is in our midst and what should we do in order to recognize the Jesus present in us. And it may be, for some, given family situations, do you recognize Jesus in the life of your spouse, your children, or if you're a single person, do you recognize Jesus in the person of those who you work with? Do you allow them to shine the light of Christ on you? And this is the big challenge of Lent. How much time do we allow ourselves the gift of time to see Jesus once more in our midst? So there's my first recommendation for Lent. We read the scriptures, we ponder the message, particularly of Jesus in our midst. And I did say earlier, perhaps to read the Passion accounts in the Gospel. But I might also recommend to you to read Luke's infancy narratives about the birth of Jesus and see if you, or I for that matter, are like the wise men who can recognize who Jesus is, or like the shepherds who can recognize that this person is somebody important in our lives. After all, Herod did. He was scared stiff. We don't have to be scared of Jesus. We have to reach out, touch him as that little child did, feeling the face of God in the people we meet.